They expected you to scream, to throw fists, throw blame, throw back the poison they poured into your name. You see, they waited for the breakdown. They circled, hungry for your rage, for the spectacle of your destruction, but you gave them nothing. Not a flinch, not a spark, just silence, sharp, unnerving, ancient. The kind of silence that doesn't come from fear, but from a place so deep, so untouched, that even your enemies mistook it for absence. They didn't know silence could be a weapon. They didn't know it could be prophecy. They crossed you, not with blades, but with betrayal sharper than steel. Lies spoken in whispers that grew teeth. Eyes that once held warmth turned glassy. You saw them shift one by one, wearing masks molded in cowardice, and yet you didn't fight. You didn't defend your name. You let the fire spread unchecked, not because you couldn't stop it, but because you wanted to see who would fan the flame, who would step forward, and who would disappear. It wasn't silent, it was observation, strategic, surgical, cold. There's a moment, one that only a few ever reach, where your soul fractures, not from weakness but from clarity, when you finally understand that the people you bled for would let you die thirsty. That truth has no value in a crowd addicted to scandal. And when that moment came, you didn't collapse. You converted. You became untouchable, not by force, but by removal. You stepped outside the game. You let them war among themselves in a battlefield built from their own illusions. They thought you lost, but you were simply elsewhere. You started to see time differently, not in seconds or days, but in echoes, in pattern. You noticed how their laughter had a hollow ring to it, how their victories felt forced, how their smiles never reached their eyes. They tried to erase you, but they couldn't stop talking about you. You became a ghost they summoned in every insecure gesture, in every anxious glance over their shoulder, and still, you said nothing, because silence isn't emptiness. It's focus. It's the sound a blade makes right before it strikes. You weren't gone. You were watching, learning, evolving. What they mistook for weakness was simply patient, ancient, primal. The patience of wolves watching deer forget the woods are not theirs. You knew if you screamed, they'd say you were unstable. If you cried, they'd call it guilt. You didn't break. You evolved in that silence. The version of you they tried to kill learned how to walk through walls. They looked away, but you were still in the room, not as a face, as a weight, as a shadow they couldn't shake. You became the reflection they avoided at night, the part of the story they could never quite explain when asked too many questions. And the worst part for them, you said nothing. You let the walls speak, and they did. They spoke of guilt, of fear, of the slow realization that maybe they had created something they couldn't control. Maybe your silence was never weakness. Maybe it was strategy. Maybe they hadn't destroyed you. They had concentrated, refined you. And now when they sit alone long after the noise has died, they still hear you. Not your voice, but your presence. Impossibly loud, impossibly still. A name that echoes in every corridor they sealed with their own hands. They thought no one was watching, that their laughter dissolved into the void, that their cruelty could live without consequence. In their minds, your silence was a dead end. No echo, no ripple, just absence. They didn't know about the watchers. Not people, not friends, not some imaginary audience waiting to cheer you on. No, the watchers are older than recognition, more precise than memory. They live in the quiet angles of every room, hidden behind every betrayal, woven between each moment they thought you were broken. You felt them, not with your skin, deeper than that. Like a temperature shift in a memory, like the weight of a gaze on the back of your mind. You were never truly alone, only unacknowledged. Every time they mocked you behind closed doors, a watcher blinked slowly, every lie dressed in silk and handed to your name recorded. They do not interfere, they document. The ledger they keep is not on paper but in pattern, energy, weight, repetition. Not karma, not fate, just consequence. Delayed but exact. You weren't passive. You were gathering, observing in return. Their betrayal didn't break you. It split you open and introduced you to your second self, the one that doesn't flinch, the one that doesn't forget. You wore invisibility like armor, walking through a battlefield where the arrows never stopped, and you never once drew your sword. And that's what terrified them. Eventually, that you never reacted, that you let them spend every weapon they had, and still you stood. There's a myth among ancient tacticians that the greatest power is not to strike first or last, but to make the enemy think you never needed to strike at all. That's what you became, an equation they couldn't solve, a silence that grew louder the more they tried to discredit it. They started to look over their shoulders, not because they feared you, but because they feared what watched through you. They thought they were writing your ending, but the watchers were writing theirs. You could feel the shift when it began, the hesitation in their tone, the misalignment in their performance, the cracks, because regret doesn't arrive with horns. It seeps in through routine, through the little ways they begin to see your face in places you never stood. A song, a street, a memory that won't shut off. The watchers ensured it, not out of vengeance, out of balance. And still, you said nothing. That was always the part they couldn't understand. Why you never screamed back. Why you never tried to clear your name. Why you didn't expose their rot for the world to see. But you weren't interested in justice handed out by temporary crowds. You wanted the truth to become fossilized in their timeline. You let them bury themselves while you built in silence. That was the deal. You would not resist, but you would remember. Not golden, out to have. No, your throne was carved from their guilt, forged in their shame, polished by the regret they didn't yet know would consume them. You didn't need revenge, you needed memory, and memory, unlike rage, doesn't burn out. It lingers, it echoes in the quiet moments when they're alone, when they realize what they destroyed was the only thing real around them. Now they kneel, not out of loyalty, but confusion. They can't understand how you rose. They don't remember building the platform that lifted you, but they feel it in their bones. You became something other. You became the embodiment of consequence without violence, a living symbol that what they tried to discard came back, taller, colder, and untouchable. You sit above now, not because you clawed your way there, but because they laid the bricks. Their hate was so efficient it became architecture, and every time they look up, they see the design of their own undoing. Your strength is not loud. It does not announce itself. It waits. It watches. It reminds. You didn't fight back. You didn't shout. You didn't explain your side to those who had already decided to misunderstand you. That restraint became your crown. That silence became your armor. And the throne, the heavy, magnificent, cursed throne, was not a prize you sought. It was the inevitable result of what happens when the underestimated refuse to disappear. They gave you power because they thought you had none. They gave you clarity because they thought you were broken. In trying to erase your story, they carved it deeper. And now, the throne you sit on is colder than stone, older than betrayal, and heavier than any vengeance could have been. You don't need to speak. The silence says everything. There was a time you would have answered their message within seconds. You would have rushed to decode their tone, over-explained your silence, stretched yourself thin just to make them feel comfortable after they made you feel invisible. You'd replay conversations in your head, wondering what you could have said differently, as if their betrayal had been your fault. But now, the silence they hear is not confusion. It's not hesitation. It's distance. Cold, deliberate, irreversible distance. They reach for you now, clumsily, like people trying to summon a ghost they no longer understand. They send words heavy with guilt, but light on accountability. They pretend not to remember how many times they chose the crowd over you, How many lies they let pass because truth wasn't convenient. They tiptoe back into your atmosphere, unaware that your orbit has changed, that you no longer revolve around their gravity. What they don't understand is that you didn't become unreachable overnight. You were made unreachable, forged in the quiet agony of unanswered calls, unmet loyalty, twisted narratives. Every time they laughed when you weren't looking, every time they exchanged your pain for popularity, you shed something, bit by bit, until there was no longer anything left of the version of you that needed their approval to breathe. You didn't move on. You evolved past their language, past their rituals, past their entire concept of closeness. Now you exist in a frequency they can't hear, not because you speak another language, but because you speak no language at all, just presence, just outcomes. You don't announce your return, you don't hint at your moves. You became the echo that doesn't need to bounce back, the myth that exists without needing to be proven. And still, they search for a door, a crack, a code, something that would let them back in. But the door no longer exists. It wasn't locked, it was dismantled. And the key they used to hold, your empathy, your trust, your willingness to understand, it rusted in their hand the moment they chose pride or apology. You became unreachable, not by hiding, but by ascending, by climbing the staircase made of every "I'm fine" you said when you weren't, every time you stood alone and decided to endure, rather than retaliate. You became unreachable because you stopped being someone could be summoned. You became the storm that does not return calls, the sea that doesn't explain its tides, the silence that doesn't owe anyone a sound. And now they call it ego, they call it being cold, but the truth is ancient. You can't unburn ashes, you can't step into the same river once it's turned to fire. And you are no longer water, you are no longer breakable. You are the flame that remembers who lit the match, and simply refuses to warm their hands. Let them stare from a distance, let them wonder, let them mourn the version of you they mistook for weak. That version is long gone, and in its place stands something they cannot reach, cannot label, cannot destroy. You, untouched, unapologetic, unreachable. They don't speak your name anymore, not because they forgot, but because it tastes like ash in their mouths, a ghost of the person they once mocked, twisted, underestimate. Back then you were the absence in the room they pretended not to see, the one who absorbed betrayal like roots absorb poison, not to die, but to grow unkillable. You never raised your voice, never demanded justice, never begged to be seen. You vanished quietly, deliberately, and in that silence, something ancient stirred. The world moved on, or so they thought, their lives filled with noise, repetition, the hollow rituals of those who never questioned the scripts handed to them. But you weren't in that loop, you were somewhere else, somewhere they couldn't follow. In solitude you forged what they could never understand, self-respect that didn't need validation, identity that didn't crave applause, and power didn't scream. While they recycled borrowed personas, you became a myth they could no longer. You were no longer it, you became the consequence. Their regret grew slow, quiet, like mold behind a perfect wall. At first they told themselves you were bitter, weak, irrelevant, but time has a way of exposing cracks. Their triumphs felt artificial, their wins haunted by the memory of the one they tried to erase. It crept in when they heard your name in and felt the tighten, when your image flashed somewhere unexpected and their chest filled with something between panic and you were not forgotten, you were etched in timelines, in whispers, in outcomes they couldn't control. What they failed to understand is that legacy isn't built by noise, it's built by what survives it. And you survived the lies, the betrayals, the thousand invisible wounds they thought would hollow you out. You didn't shatter, you sharpened, you learned to carry beneath silk, invisible, always present. They moved, yes, but they never escaped, because you were the echo in the decisions they second, the shadow behind their smiles, the mirror they couldn't look for too long. You walked now, not with pride, with precision, not seeking attention, commanding. Your silence no longer feels empty. It feels sacred, like the hush cathedral or the pause before it. And those who once stood above you, they can't meet your eyes, because you no longer reflect version of you. You reflect perception. You become everything they said you'd never be, not in spite of, but because of how completely you let loose at you. And now rooms they talk about the past as fiction, rewrite themselves as heroes, hoping anyone will but the truth lives in the space you let, in the weight of your absence. You don't haunt them, you want revenge. You haunt them as you outgrow, and they know deep down they built the throne you sit on, hands stained by regret. You don't. Legends don't walk backwards, they rise, disappear, and leave behind a silence that's louder than any scream. They believed no one saw what they did in the dark. They were wrong. The Watchers never blink, and now neither do you. There wasn't a sound when the old version of you died. I've no lightning strike, no ceremony, no tearful farewell, just a quiet severing, like the last thread of a spider's web snipped in the dark. You didn't even notice it at first. It was subtle, a missed heartbeat, a cold breath, a sudden lack of reaction to things that once set you on fire. The part of you that begged to be understood just stopped speaking. They didn't realize what they'd done. When they twisted your name, when they orchestrated your exile, when they shattered every version of trust you had left, they weren't just trying to hurt you. They were trying to shape you into something smaller. But pressure doesn't always break. Sometimes it forges. And while they celebrated your silence, mistaking it for defeat, you were decomposing quietly, beautifully, inwardly. You were being undone, not to disappear, but to re-emerge as something they would never recognize again. There was a time you longed for clarity, for fairness, for closure. You wrote letters in your mind you'd never send, crafted monologues for conversations that would never happen. You used to run those scenes like ancient rituals, thinking maybe, just maybe, they'd see what they did, that they'd flinch, that they'd regret. But then came the shift, not a breaking point, but an absence. The craving left, the questions no longer mattered, the need for them to feel what you felt, gone. Not forgiven, not forgotten, just irrelevant. That's when you knew something sacred had ended. The version of you that needed them had perished. What stood in its place wasn't a warrior. Warriors still seek battle. What emerged was colder, quieter, something more elemental. You started watching like the sea watches the shore, unmoved by the temporary. Their guilt no longer pierced you. Their regret no longer fed you. You simply observed, detached, like a god reviewing archived sins. People asked where you went, why you were so still. They thought it was depression or numbness or bitterness, but they were wrong. It wasn't decay, it was evolution. The caterpillar doesn't grieve its legs when it grows wings. And you had shed a skin so many times that even your shadow no longer recognized you. They kept playing the same games, whispering the same lies, caught in the same rituals. But you had outgrown the chessboard. You weren't a player anymore. You were the silence between their moves, the glitch in their strategy, the unspoken weight that haunted every room you used to enter. They still tried to bait you, a comment here, a glance there, but you had become untouchable in the most brutal way possible, not by rising above but by ceasing to care whether they looked up. And there's power in that, not loud power, not the kind that shouts or burns or takes, but the kind that outlasts, the kind that doesn't blink. You no longer needed a voice to speak vengeance. Your existence became the prophecy. Every success they tried to bury, every scar you wore like ceremonial paint, every absence you maintained like a fortress made of air. This is what they never understood. You didn't want revenge, you wanted peace, and in choosing peace you became their punishment. You didn't climb a throne, you became it, and they kneel to it every day, not out of worship, but out of memory, because long after they've forgotten their words, they'll still remember the day you stopped needing them, the day the old you died, and nothing was ever the same again. They thought it wouldn't cost them, and not in the moment. The smirk, the whisper, the slight tilt of the head when they mentioned your name like it was something dirty on their tongue. It felt good to them. Quick dopamine, a flash of control, a tribal grin around people who agree without knowing why. They didn't just betray you, they built a theater around it, and when you didn't fight back, they mistook it for failure, as if your silence was the end of your story, not the beginning of theirs. But regret doesn't arrive like thunder. It's a drip, a hum, a slow unraveling in the background of their new lives. At first they didn't notice. They celebrated, moved on, maybe even laughed when your name was mentioned, just a footnote, a character they wrote out of the script. But silence echoes louder than applause in empty rooms, and every success they achieved was underscored by something missing, a shadow just out of frame, an unease in the mirror, because somewhere along the line, they started to feel it. Not guilt, no, they're not that evolved. Regret, a spiritual debt that couldn't be erased with time or noise. You became the gap in their narrative, the one they had to explain away, even if no one asked. Your name. Once a joke started tasting different when they said it, bitter, heavy, because deep down they knew the part they played. They knew you didn't fall, you chose not to respond. That's what haunts them now, not your anger, not your presence, but your absence, because power that doesn't seek vengeance is the hardest to understand. It turns you into a question mark they can't answer. A silence that breaks their internal monologue. They told themselves you were irrelevant, yet their mind won't stop bringing you back. At night, they rewrite the script. In the quiet, where performance dies and memory sharpens, they think about what they said, how they moved on too quickly, how they tore you down thinking it made them taller, and it eats at them, not because they love you, but because they know they were small when they could have been more. You didn't need revenge. Their conscience is doing the work for you, whispering in dark corners, showing them scenes they tried to erase. Regret is a currency paid in solitude, in second guesses, in tight chests and shallow breaths, when no one's watching. And the worst part, there's no one to blame, not anymore. The audience is gone. The tribe that cheered has scattered. Now it's just them, the architect standing in the ruins of their own image, realizing the throne they thought they climbed was made of splinters, and your silence was the final nail. Every fake smile they wear costs them more now. Every success they share online is another performance, another layer of desperation. Because they see it now, you didn't lose, you just stopped playing. They thought they were burying you, when in fact, they were building their own tombstone, engraved, not with what they did, but with what they could never undo. That's the true punishment, not yours, theirs, and they carry it every day, quietly, endlessly, paying in regret. They tried to erase you with the very tools they were too blind to understand. Whispers behind doors, grins dressed in friendly masks, orchestrated silences that made the room feel colder when you entered. They didn't just want you gone, they wanted you buried in doubt, unseen, unheard, unwritten. So they dug, they clawed at your name like it was dirt, convinced they could pile enough of their projections to smother you in irrelevance. And you let them dig. Every betrayal, every manipulation, you didn't resist it. You catalogued it. You felt each blade, each wound, each moment of humiliation, and then you let it sink, not into your skin but deep into the foundations of something great. They thought your silence meant surrender, but you weren't laying down. You were lying in wait. While they laughed, you listened. While they you studied. You saw how quickly their loyalty was bought, how desperate they were to be seen as clever architects of your downfall. What they didn't realize was that they weren't buried. They were building something. Every insult, every rumor, every ounce of cruelty. They were placing stone atop stone, metal against metal. And while they believed they were sealing your fate beneath their design, they were unknowingly constructing your throne.